Now, in this video, I want to talk about Locke's analysis of innate speculative principles. So I'm in the essay, still in book 1, now chapter 2, and it's no innate speculative principles. So you'd think that Locke would jump in and immediately go for innate ideas and try to refute their existence. He doesn't do that. He starts off with principles. Why? Well, that's probably largely a historical reason, because many people, thought that we had all kinds of innate principles of reasoning. So things about the world, that logical laws, for instance, a lot of people thought those were innate. Mathematical laws might be innate. And innate, remember, just being stamped on the soul. Somehow God stamped them on us, on our souls, and then you're born knowing these things and maybe experience, as we saw in Plato, just kind of jiggles these things and they come up to the surface. And also, Locke's target is actually in the next chapter, where people also at this time, and this was where Locke in a lot of trouble, is people thought that you had to have a good anchor of moral principles, do no evil, those kinds of things, be good, whatever principles you want to talk about. Sometimes Locke refers to them as like moral maxims or moral principles. Those two had to be deeply anchored in the soul, and if they weren't, look out, right? Everything goes haywire. Put that to the side for a second. Locke first wants to look at things like, is it really the case that logical principles are innate? Are they stamped on our souls? And so that was quite common. Not everybody believed it. You can go back into the medievals and find certain thinkers and theologians that didn't think so. But if you look in various places in what the Bible, which was an influential text that Locke also was influenced by, there are passages that seem to read that that these kinds of rules, not so much logic, but certainly moral rules were written on, I think it's in Romans, where it talks about moral rules being written on the heart or in the depths of the soul. So what's Locke think about all this? Well, he wants to refute it. So this chapter is a series of putting forth an argument for innate principles and Locke trying to knock it down. Does he knock everything down? No. Does he cover every possible argument? No. But he covers what he thinks probably are the main ones that people use. And I'll go over a few of them so you get the flavor of what's going on. Locke says that there's no innate principles, as if they were stamped, and he could convince you that this is a false belief, that is, that innate principles are there, if he could show you that these principles and ideas are found in experience. Remember, plain historic method. If I could find them all in experience, why would you then say, oh, they must be stamped on the mind? No, I can show you from everyday experience where you got that. Might say, well, you could reply to Locke and say, well, okay, just because you can show me that an idea or a principle, I got it from experience, that doesn't absolutely prove that it wasn't stamped on my soul by God, right? And Locke admits, no, it really doesn't. But he says, on the other hand, it'd be kind of impertinent, that's the term Locke uses, but a little counterintuitive, that if you believe God created you, and God created you such that you could learn all about the world, I could show you all the ideas that you have, they come through your experience. So God created you with a soul that has the faculties of gathering ideas and coming forward with them and constructing knowledge and all that through this sort of the plain historical method. I can show that you got all those things, but yet you want to say that God gave you all those powers to be able to do that and yet stamped innate ideas onto you and innate principles. That seems to be, a bit disrespectful that God would do both of those. That seems redundant, right? Why would God do both? He'd do one or the other. And Locke is saying, if I can show that he did one and you can't show that he did the other, but I can't disprove it, then wouldn't you naturally say, well, okay, I guess we're going to go with what we can show rather than with what we just postulate, but we can't show and we can't disprove either. So you try to wrap your head around Locke's program here. He's not saying that he can absolutely, unquestionably refute the notion of innate ideas. He's just saying, and principles, he's just saying he can make it seem very unreasonable as contrasted with this reasonable approach that he's offering. So again, keep in mind what Locke is doing. So what's an argument that people use? Well, here's a summarized version. One argument for innate principles is from universal consent. What is that? Well, in the premise, everybody agrees on some principle X. Maybe it's a logical principle. It doesn't really matter for now, but let's just look at the structure of the argument. So everyone agrees on some principle. Yeah, you have universal agreement, right? Therefore, well, it's got to be innate. Now, Locke says this is a common one when people do this. But Locke then says, okay, let's look at this from a variety of angles. And again, I'm not going to go all through the Locke's discussion, but it gives you a good idea of reasoning, philosophical reasoning at work. Locke says, what X works here? What can you find? Is there one? Is there such an X? In other words, can you find something that we all agree? And the we, right, when we say we all agree, Locke expands it. If he says, well, look, if it's the case that something's innate, right, wouldn't we all have it, right? Why would some people not have it? Why would some? So Locke does presuppose a kind of equivalence amongst all people, right? So that's an interesting point. That lays the groundwork for notions of rights and things like that. But from an epistemological perspective, we're all kind of the same. So what is it that everybody agrees on? What would make, put it this way, what could you substitute for X that would make that statement true? And Locke says, I can't think of anything, right? So even when you take, is there such an X? It seems no. Whatever you put in for X, you will find someone that won't agree with it. Locke says, if you put in a logical proposition or a mathematical proposition and then go ask a little child, before it, a little child like maybe like kindergarten or a really young child that you can talk to, and you say, 2 plus 2, what's 2 plus 2 equal to? They don't know. Locke would say, yeah, well, go look at kids. They don't know a lot of stuff, right? Or ask a kid, is it possible for something to simultaneously exist and not exist? Do you believe that, or what do you think? Little kid's going to not have a clue what you're talking about. So Locke is saying that if you go and you cherry pick, and you say, I'm only going to talk to a bunch of mathematicians or people that are educated, whatever. Sure, you can find large groups of people that agree that 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. And, Locke doesn't say this, but it's implied by his text, most people forgot that they learned 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. So forgetting when you learn something, forgetting your learning history, it makes it easy for you to think you always knew it. But Locke says there was a time when you didn't know 2 plus 2 is equal to 4. You maybe can't even remember it. And as the old slogan goes, if you know 2 plus 2 is equal to 4, you have to thank a teacher, or maybe your mom or your grandma. But someone taught it to you. You learned it. You learned how to count. You weren't born. Newborns don't know how to count. So Locke's approach is that there's really no such X. So if you try and put an X in there, right, that is like a logical law or a mathematical law, nothing's going to work. There's nothing that we all agree on. So this first premise is not even true, right? So the argument doesn't even get off the ground. Is there such an X? Okay, but let's say, all right, Locke, maybe we can't find an X right now. That's going to work. Maybe, but in principle, if we could, that would be an argument. So the argument's still a pretty good argument. We just can't find an X that's going to make that first statement true. So in other words, if we could find it, what if you could find an X, right? Would it work? Would the argument work? And Locke wants to say, still, no, the argument's not going to work, right? Why? Well, even if you found that everyone agreed on some principle, let's say you found some principle, call it Z, right? So everybody agrees on Z. Why does that make Z innate, right? Why? right? Why does agreement entail innateness? That's what you want to show. You can't just presuppose it, right? So if someone says, well, agreement entails innateness, you can say why. Why? And if they say, well, it's just a law that agreement entails innateness, if you agree, then it's innate, you could question that law. Where'd you get that law from? That agreement entails innateness. So Locke says this argument fails on a lot of accounts. It looks good. It's seductive. Yeah, it looks nice and neat and tidy. But when you really start thinking about it, it doesn't really work at all. So, let's say you found everybody agreed, I don't know, let's just, for example, everybody agreed that the sky is blue, right? Well, I don't think we would then say, that would be a nice counterexample. The sky is blue, everybody agrees. Is that innate? Locke would say, well, you can find an experience all over the place. Everybody has a similar experience. Water is wet, right? That doesn't make water is wet innate. It just, you say, well, everybody has the same experience. So when people are born and they start living on the planet, right, they have the same experiences. And so people have the same description of water. But that, because everybody agrees on the description of water, you wouldn't say that that description is innate. So these arguments, they look good, they're seductive, right? Yeah, it looks like you got an argument for innateness, and really universal consent doesn't do much. It just tells you that people agree. Likewise, just to extrapolate a little, universal disagreement doesn't entail much either. If you want to say something like nobody agrees on morality, that might be a fact. Maybe you can't find universal agreement on morality, but you can't then infer that there is no such thing as morality or there are no objective principles just because people can't agree on them. So these, shall we say, these arguments, they are seductive because they lead us to think we know more than we do. And again, that's all part of Locke's general approach of trying to put the brakes on what we're thinking about our understanding and look at what the understanding really offers us. And he says it's full of limits. So this isn't going to work. And Locke also wants to, and I think this is an important thing and to point out here is, if someone says, you could have an innate principle but not know it, right? Locke finds that a very puzzling one. And the reason why he finds it puzzling gives us more of an insight into how Locke thinks. He says something like this: if you could have something stamped on your soul and not know it, if you have something innate that's revealed later, as we saw with Plato would have thought that. Yeah, Socrates is like, I'm just trying to help, the whole midwife analogy, the maieutic method, right? I'm not here to put anything in your soul. I'm here to help you give birth to the ideas that are there, whatever's in there. I'm trying to help it out. And of course, the metaphor is bring it to the surface of consciousness, right? You're going to know what's in there, and then you may have to give it away or not. Locke thinks that there's something deeply problematic about that. Could you have an innate principle but not know it? So this means that the mind somehow could have something in it that it doesn't know about. And Locke thinks that that's very strange. Why does he think that's strange? Well, in this sense, he is picking up on some of Descartes' thinking. Remember, I said that he rejected the notion that the mind or the soul has a special faculty of insight into nature or itself. Locke disagreed with something special there, but Locke did think that with introspection, when you look into the contents of your mind, it's not with any special power, but you can examine the contents of your mind and know what's there, and things won't elude you. Yeah, you may struggle to find a memory or whatever. That's not a big deal. But to say that something is stamped there and you don't know it, you're just searching for it, and there's something in the mind that you can't know, that the mind is somehow got stuff in it that it doesn't know about. Locke thought that this was pretty well absurd. Now, why does he think it's absurd? Because the mind is self-transparent. In other words, to use a very lovely image from the great American thinker, or in 19th century American thinker, said, Charles Saunders Peirce. Peirce said that a lot of the history of philosophy, especially with these British guys like Hume and Locke, and Irish, good Irishman Bishop Berkeley, and going back, of course, to the continent with the French thinker René Descartes. They thought that the mind had a glassy essence. In other words, it was clear. It could look and peer into its depths. Plato was wrong. It doesn't have murky depths or whatever. No. It's nice and clear. This was quite a dominant view and was largely rejected by a number of thinkers, especially when you get to guys like Nietzsche in the late 19th century. But of course, most famously and most influentially, Sigmund Freud said, no, the mind is full of all kinds of things that it doesn't necessarily know about. And not only is the mind full of things that, you got to sit in a chair or you got to talk to, you lie down on the couch and you talk to your analyst, and the analyst helps bring this back to the surface, just like Socrates. Not only was that the case, but that the mind, says Sigmund Freud, has things in it that pushes the mind around, and the mind doesn't even know. So not only can you have things in your mind that you don't know about, you can have causal agents in your mind that you don't necessarily know about. Pretty different than Locke's position. Locke would have thought that was madness, and even contradictory to say a non-transparent mind. Minds by nature are transparent. So keep in mind that these are things that Locke is bringing into the conversation. He's not arguing for them. He's just stating them up front as just stands to reason that the mind can see everything that's in it. Well, you might be able to debate that sensibly. All right, so some say, well, okay, what about, and this is similar, so you can see why Locke wouldn't like this argument too much. Another argument for innate principles was, well, when you come to the use of reason, and you know principles, so that all comes in one fell swoop, something like that. Right? So then kids, they don't know it, but once kids hit the age of reason, they come to know these things. Doesn't that show they're innate? Doesn't that, once reason kicks in, right? And all of a sudden they know these things that they didn't know before? Maybe that's a good argument for innate principles. Locke says something like this. Okay, what exactly here? Let's put a little asterisk by this. What does that really mean? And here Locke is, got a bit of bite in his writing. So the gentle Locke shows a little bit of, shall we say, couple fangs here. And he says, for those people that don't seriously examine their words and their unexamined statements and phrases, they pass off as reasoned thought. Okay, maybe you can talk like that. But once you dig into this, what does it mean to come to the use of reason? Locke thinks that it's not exactly a clear expression, and it's not clear what it means. And also, so this is unclear. And just as an aside, Locke wants to settle something about the notion of reason. Right? Reason, the concept of reason, has had a very storied past in the history of philosophy. What does reason mean? You can get lots of different answers. Some people thought it was a kind of power. Some people thought it was all kind of special insight. Some people thought it was something that was given to us by the gods, or a candlelight. There's all kinds of images as to what reason is. But Locke says that reason is something a little bit more mechanical than that. For Locke, so reason really is just deducing truths from known truths. It's no really big special power. He's very similar to Aristotle. Aristotle talks like this. Aristotle, of course, says reason has more than this. Reason has a special kind of power of seeing, right? This sort of non-sensorial power of seeing truth. Locke says, no, it's actually, Aristotle was partly right, that reason is just deducing truths from known truths. So reason is much more mechanical. It's much more prosaic. right? And if you come to the use of reason and you know principles, and that using reason, whatever reason finds is evidence for it being innate, well then Locke says, oh my goodness, look at how much stuff's going to be innate, right? You use reasoning in mathematics, you use reasoning to find out new truths all the time in logic and mathematics. That's going to make all that stuff innate. That's going to plug the mind up. Is that false that the mind is plugged up with stuff? Locke says, I don't know for sure, but think about the consequences of when you bring something in like this and say the use of reason leads to principles, and those principles, therefore, because you use reason to get them, they're innate. Locke says, well, my goodness, man, the mind is just full, just chock-a-block with innate stuff. So in that sense, Locke is using, right, some ideas that he has, right, and in this one, he uses a specific concept of reason to say, look, it's just this. And if you say it combined reason gives us that, and therefore they're innate, he says you get a large number of things that are innate. You just start plugging the soul up like crazy. Maybe it produces, shall we say, that argument ends up not producing too little. It makes too much innate. So that's another mode of philosophical reasoning, is taking your opponent's argument and saying, okay, if you're right, here are the consequences. And maybe there are a number of unpalatable consequences. That's one of the angles that Locke is using here. Is it a knockdown argument? No. But does it make the innateness question a little more unreasonable? Yes, says Locke, and that's all he's after. So not rigorous. Notice, they're not like Socrates. He's not trying to offer us absolutely rigorous knockdown proofs. He's trying to make things look reasonable and look very unreasonable. Take the side of things that look reasonable. All right. And also, Locke says, even if you say that coming to the use of reason is like with little kids, little kids, so sometimes with children, people say, they have the quote-unquote age of reason. And when they come to the age of reason, sometimes thought to be around 6-ish years of age, once they hit the age of reason, then all of a sudden, at the same time, you have things like they understand logical laws, etc., etc. And sometimes even at the age of reason, people say, well, that's when they understand ethics. And Locke is not saying, there's maybe no connection there. He's saying, yeah, probably. But he says a couple of things about this. You know what? This age of reason and logical truths are not always that connected. Lots of little kids, they're reasoning their way around the world like crazy. They're figuring out stuff. They're making rational choices and all that. And they're making rational choices without understanding logic in any way. So you have a kid that can make fully rational choices of, if you say, you've got this to do and that to do and that to do, which one are you going to do first? Well, I don't know, it's cold outside, so before I leave the school, I'm going to put my boots on. So children from a very young age, if they're not too excited about getting out to the playground, they can make that kind of choice. And we would call that a rational choice. And Locke says, lots of kids make these rational choices. They don't know logic, but they still can act reasonably. So tying these two together seems to be false, says Locke. And it seems to be not only false, but it's a little bit frivolous, because even if a child does have this link, at the time of the use of reason, that also came to know those principles. Even if that happened to be, shall we say, concurrent, it still doesn't show that a logical truth is innate, right? Why not? Because Locke gives a nice little example. You come to use of sometimes you come to the use of speech. Other things, like instead of the use of reason, come to the use of speech, and then you, through your achievement of speech, you come to know things. Well, we wouldn't say that concurrence of come to use of speech and understanding a logical law, we wouldn't say that, well, therefore that logical law must be innate. So the concurrence argument, which is what we could call this concurrence argument, the and, use of reason, and know principles, and innate, that doesn't really prove anything either. Once again, you're trying to sneak in a hidden premise of concurrence. If two things are concurrent, therefore the one thing, the act of reason, and the thing known, while that makes the thing known innate, Locke says you still haven't really got a good argument for that. You're still claiming it, and he thinks in the end it's a rather frivolous claim. Why would the coincidence of coming to reason and knowing a logical truth necessitate that logical truth being innate? So, as I said, there's lots of twists and turns here. I've only given a couple, but this is the flavor of much of the discussion in this chapter. So Locke is going to shift gears here and talk a little bit less about the problems with innate things, and he wants to shift gears and talk a little bit about the mind. When Locke talks about the mind, his little bit here, in, shall we say, in a more positive way, as opposed to attacking arguments that for innate speculative principles, and he says something a little bit, shall we say, more positive about what is going on, you can look at sections 15 and 16. So sections, still in chapter 2, book 1, chapter 2, sections 15 and 16. Locke offers us some elements of what's going on here in the mind. He says something like this, and he uses a famous image this famous image of the mind that he uses elsewhere. He uses the image of the mind or soul as a cabinet. Well, I should be a little bit more precise. As the empty cabinet. But don't be fooled. The mind has capacities or faculties. It's not completely empty. Empty in the sense of the mind doesn't originate with speculative principles and innate ideas, or innate speculative principles and innate ideas. Doesn't have that. So the senses at first let in. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit. The senses let in ideas and furnish the yet empty cabinet. And the mind, by degrees, growing familiar with some of these ideas, some of them, they are lodged in the memory. And names got to them. So the mind builds up ideas and it names them. And so he's now talking a little bit about how language works. We'll see that later in book 3. And by degrees learns the use of general names. So at first, when you look at, and you think about it, if you watch a little kid, they'll usually give the general name to a particular, right? So dog to the kid isn't a general name. Dog to a very small child is the child's dog, right? So that dog. Then it takes a while for a child to learn, no, that dog isn't actually a name like Joe. Dog is a more general abstract term. But it starts off by attaching an image from the experience of having a dog, comes into the soul, right? This image, this idea of dog, and then it gets the term dog attached to it. And by degrees, the child learns more about abstract terms. This is Locke telling, again, this gentle, plain historic method, telling the stories. So the mind comes to be furnished with ideas and language, the materials about which to exercise its discursive faculty, reason, discursive faculty, and the use of reason becomes daily more visible as these materials that give it employment, give reason something to do, increase. But though the having of general ideas and the use of general words and reason usually grow together, yet I see not how any way this proves this innate. So yeah, your reasoning gets better, your ideas become, there's more of them. This doesn't prove anything about ideas is innate. So the knowledge of some truths, it's early in the mind, but in a way, doesn't show them to be innate. So Locke says, that things appear and all that in the mind, but this is through the course of experience. None of this shows that anything's innate, right? So this has been, shall we say, an invalid inference from the history of someone's learning to that mind was stamped with those ideas or speculative principles in the first place. Okay, so there's a little more going on in 15, but that's the gist of it. In 16, Locke gives you a nice little example. A child knows not that 3 and 4 are equal to 7 till he comes to be able to count to 7 and has got the name and idea of equality. So what does that little equals sign mean? Children don't know that right away. It takes a while for them to get that idea, right? To get the concept, or to quote unquote get it and call that equality. We learned that. We're not born with that. All right, so to get the idea, and then upon explaining those words, he then will assent to or perceives the truth of the proposition that 3 plus 4 is 7. That is something that emerges later on after you have a lot of understanding. And then he will, the truth of it will appear as soon as he's settled in his mind these distinct ideas. So once you get the ideas from experience, then you start to recognize the relationships. It's not that you know all the relationships in advance. That comes later. All right, and then he knows the truth of that proposition in the same way that, Locke says that different things are different from each other. So these are things that are all learned. And afterwards, then the child comes to learn things, again, this is still in 16, that it is impossible for the same thing to be and not to be. These are things that eventually the child does learn. And so all these things are not innate. They come about by a process of education and learning. All right, so when we think about that, so Locke says, even the propositions, so another argument that Locke wants to look at is one from when there is what Locke says an immediate assent, that immediate assent upon first hearing, right? Some people thought that if there are propositions that you just immediately, upon you hear them, you just agree with them, that's evidence for innateness. So another argument for the innateness is if you hear it right away, the minute you hear it, right away you agree with it. Locke says that's problematic too, and I can construct various kinds of propositions. So the innateness, like Locke, but Locke, here's one thing that we have to keep clear. Locke agrees that if something is innate, if a proposition were innate, which he doesn't think there are any, but if they were, yeah, when you heard it, you would assent to it immediately. He thinks that's true. The question is can you flip that? Can you go from if a proposition is innate, then when you hear it, you're going to immediately agree with it, to saying, oh no, it's the other way applies as well, that if you immediately agree upon hearing it, therefore it must be innate? Locke says no, that doesn't follow. And he gives a little example about understanding color. So through experience, you learn color words, right? Like red and blue. All right? So he's saying that the ideas that you have and of red and blue, and you name them, right? Because remember, that's not the idea. That's just a word. That's the English. Could be rouge or bleu. Doesn't matter, right? So you have different languages have different words, but it's the same idea. So when you're thinking about rouge or red, you've got the same idea before your mind. You just have different terms. That's okay. Then, when you learn those via experience, all right, now think about the proposition that you would agree with right away. Once a kid understands these, a kid will assent. If you say something like, all right, little Sally, you've been working on the colors, you've been doing a fine job. What do you think? Is this true? Red is not blue. If you said that to a little kid who's never heard that proposition before, and you said, Sally, red is not blue. What do you think of that? Do you believe that, or is that true or false? The kid would immediately go, well, yeah, red's not blue. They're different, right? Would you then say, oh, well, you must have known that all your life. You immediately assented to it. Locke says this is nonsense, right? No. The reason why the child learns it is because they know from experience, that red and blue are different in the first place. This is just formulating something that they have learned through experience. So the immediate assent can look as if they knew it all the time, but Locke says that this is kind of ridiculous. And Locke also makes another point, which is probably much deeper, is he says, in the end, an innate, and this is a point that's not really discussed much, but I think it's a key point for Locke, an innate proposition or principle, or rule, innate proposition must have innate parts. Right? That's another thing Locke is like, okay, if you want to say red is not blue and that's innate, then you're forced into saying that red and blue, and maybe terms like is and not, that these are all innate parts as well, if the proposition's innate. And Locke says, well, clearly we know that red is learned through experience. We can't find, we can easily explain it. Have we proved absolutely that red is not innate? No, but we certainly would say that we learn red through experience. So again, the key in all this, and there's much more in this chapter, the key is that if we can get rid of these innate principles, we can then really see that knowledge is a construction. That's what Locke is after. I want to show you that knowledge is a construction, so I got to get rid of these things like innate ideas and principles, because those get in the way of the notion of knowledge as construction, because knowledge would be just readily formed, right? It's just experience jiggles it loose. No, I want to get rid of that. That's an old bad Platonic model. So again, getting rid of innate principles is a key part of Locke's epistemology. His inventory of the mind is to get that stuff out of there to see what's really in the mind. Again, don't think that Locke, and we sometimes say, oh, Locke thinks the mind is a tabula rasa. Careful with that expression. It means blank. It doesn't mean necessarily blank. It means a scraped rasa, scraped slate. Locke does not think that the mind has absolutely nothing, that is a complete vacuum when you're born. He does not think that. A mind like that could not learn. It would have no ability to do anything. The mind is born with plenty of faculties, powers, abilities to associate ideas, and things like that. The mind is not a complete blank slate. But if all you mean by the mind does not have innate ideas, the mind does not have innate principles, yeah, in that sense, the mind is a blank or a scraped slate or a tabula rasa. So be careful about that expression. Locke is not saying that the mind is like just this absolute blank and then experience just splatters it. If you did, well, how could the mind do anything with what experience gives? It does stuff with experience. Again, it's more helpful to think of it as a kind of engine that runs on the petrol of ideas and principles. Those come in and the engine runs on that. Not that there's no engine whatsoever. The mind has powers and faculties upon birth, and it's full of capacities, but it can't do anything unless it has fuel. So in that way, a mind without fuel is like an engine that can't work. Locke, at the end of the chapter, addresses one other angle. He says, look, you know what? Imagine he said, imagine for a second, again, if we really did have innate ideas. Wouldn't it stand to reason that those people who are the least affected by education, sort of the purest souls. Locke, refers to people of certain cultures and whatnot. But that gets into too much stuff I don't want to. But let's just concentrate on children. Really little kids. You would think that they would be the closest to their innate ideas because their minds have been the least affected by culture and education and all the other things. They're the purest of the little minds. Wouldn't those little minds, again, picking up on the self-transparency, the glassy essence, wouldn't those little uncorrupted minds be the closest to their original imprint? Mind you, like a computer, when you first get it out of the box, that's as close as its basic formatting as it's ever going to be. The minute you start using it, it modifies and changes the environment. So wouldn't little kids really be the closest to all those innate ideas? Doesn't that stand to reason? If you think so, then why aren't they? Why is it that all these things take so long for children to learn? They seem to be incredibly far from the things you are thinking of as innate. So that's another sort of shot, a parting shot, if you will, add to the notion of innate ideas. So if we can get rid of this stuff, all this innate stuff, like for science, logical principles and, other things, propositions that we think are about the world, like red is not blue or light weights are not heavy, things like that, that we would say are part of our reasoning about the world, those are not innate. Locke says, well, if we get rid of those, then it looks like we're going to get the speculative maxims. Remember, if the speculative principles are gone, then the moral principles are going to go as well. So not only does logic go by the boards, and that's one thing to say in Locke's time, that logic and mathematics and stuff is all learned, but Locke is going to go on and say, yeah, and that goes for morals as well. Now, this is the reduction of morality to reasoning about experience. This is what got Locke into some trouble. That didn't make him any friends. And so what we're going to look at, though, is, rest assured, God has given us the tools through experience to construct all these things that we need for virtue. But before Locke does that, he's going to go and now attack moral principles as innate to get them out of the mind so that he can then turn finally to what the mind really is and look at an inventory, to do an inventory, that is, of its contents. Stay tuned.